Hello and welcome to the Lockdown Learning Podcast, a podcast designed to help all parents turned home educators as we muddled our way through helping ourselves and our children during the global lockdown. I'm your host, Kate Coleman. I'm a mother to 3 boys and a staff member at the first Sudbury School in the UK, East Kent Sudbury School.
And I'm your other host, Mark Gallivan, a father and also a staff member at a self-directed school in Colorado, USA, called Alpine Valley School. In our first episode, we talked a lot about the basics, what most of us are worried about or wondering when it comes to home education. If you haven't heard that episode yet, there's still time to catch up. You can find all past episodes by following the link in the show notes.
Today's show is all about helping to care for our children's health and well-being, something that has never been more important. This is a frightening and stressful time for all of us, and I'm sure like me, lots of you are wondering how we can be the strong, confident, caring parents that we all want to be.
It's also important that we each remember to care for our own needs. This is a difficult and scary time for us too.
It really is. I've been quite excited about this episode as our guest today is Dr. Naomi Fisher, a clinical psychologist and author, who has written in the past in a way that has not only captured my attention, but my heart too. We asked her specifically how we can help our children suffering from anxiety and whether there are any specific ways that we can support our children to safely express their worries.
Dr. Fisher has some fantastic things to say, and I have to say her advice has helped me a lot personally. I found myself hanging on her every word during the interview, and I really hope that all of you find a lot of value in what she has to say as well. She is also a big advocate for self-directed education, and I think she makes some great points on that subject as well.
As we've already mentioned, Mark and I are both involved in self-directed schools, albeit on different continents. If you'd like to learn more about either of our schools or the ethos behind them, you can find East Kent Sudbury School online at ekss.org.uk and Alpine Valley School at alpinevalleyschool.com. Both of the websites have a wealth of information available if you find yourself intrigued by anything you hear in the interview today.
Let's get into that interview now. Here's Dr. Fisher.
So hello, I'm Naomi Fisher. I'm a clinical psychologist and my children have been self-directed learners since the start. We home educated them until 2 years ago, and then for the last 2 years they've been at a self-directed school in Paris, which is where we're living right now in the middle of the lockdown. I think one of the things that families are going through in particular is the shock of everybody suddenly being together so much of the time. And in Paris, for example, most of the people I know here have no outdoor space. So we are literally in our little apartments all the time, and we're working and learning and living all in the same space, all on top of each other all the time, which I think has particular pressures for everybody, even for those who perhaps are seasoned home educators. It's quite tricky to suddenly be cast back in your own space all the time. I also think that right now is a period of very high anxiety for everybody. And none of us really expected this to happen. None of us chose for it to happen. It's out of our control. And it's a tricky time for lots of parents because we're trying to hold our children's anxiety whilst also holding our own anxiety. And I think one of the things that happens for parents is that we want to be able to give our children answers. We want to be able to reassure them. We want to be able to say, yes, it's going to be okay. We know that this is going to happen. And right now, we can't tell them when things are going to change, really. We can't tell them when they might be able to go back to school or go back to see their friends. And so we're all living with intense uncertainty. And I think that's extremely challenging for everyone. And I think that children express that uncertainty in different ways, that children are often not particularly aware of, young children in particular, they're not necessarily aware that they're experiencing anxiety. And so what can happen with young children is that they can have sleep problems, which then puts extra pressure on the whole family, because once a child isn't sleeping, then nobody's sleeping and everybody gets very tired. Children often also express their anxiety in terms of anger. So what you might see is a lot more outbursts than usual. Certainly in my household, I've seen really extreme outbursts over very, very minor things. So things that previously we would have been able to take in our stride, suddenly we can't take them in our stride anymore. And I think that's something that's happening for the adults and the children. Actually, it's not just the children. But I see it as a time where an enormous amount of psychological flexibility is being demanded of all of us, because we're having to change our lives dramatically without really having any choice about it. And when an enormous amount of psychological flexibility is required of us, we sort of start to run out. We stop being able to deal flexibly with the small things that happen on a day-to-day level, because we're coping with the big things. And that coping with the big things takes a lot of effort. And we don't necessarily see that effort in ourselves. We don't necessarily appreciate that that's what our children are managing. And so all we see are the outbursts and the fighting and the shouting, or the enormous distress over a tiny little cut on their finger. And that's really difficult for parents. So what can happen is we can get into a negative cycle, because the children are very anxious. They're expressing their anxiety through anger or through extreme reactions. The parents are anxious, that they express their anxiety through frustration. And quite soon, the environment at home can become quite tense and quite full of conflict. So I think that's one of the things that I've found lots of people coming to me to talk about, actually, in the last few weeks. Think about your priorities right now. The schoolwork will be there next week, next month, next year. It will still be there. But there are things that we won't be able to do in the future. And that's helping children manage the situation that we're living through right now. I think that if children get very, very distressed during this time, and our focus is on getting them to do their schoolwork, then we risk missing that distress. We risk missing that opportunity to help them manage their distress and anxiety. And for me, as a psychologist, well-being is at the heart of everything we do. If the child isn't able to manage their emotions, they won't be able to learn. So I think one of the things we can do is see this time. We need to see that the basis of this time is helping children manage the difficult emotions that they're going through, and managing our own difficult emotions that we're going through. And then that is a learning in itself. We don't need to be doing extra stuff, because actually it's an enormous ask. I think it's a huge ask of anybody to be sent home because there's this dangerous virus around, and then the next day you're expected to get on with your schoolwork or get on with your work. And I think lots of parents are equally struggling with that, because we know that when you're in a period of high stress, your brain reacts as if it's in danger. So your brain is reacting to a threat. Right now, the threat is the virus. We're all reacting to that threat. The way our brain reacts to stress and to threat is at a very primitive level in our brain. It's basically the same kind of reaction as we would have if we were walking through the deserts, perhaps, many, many millions of years ago. Our ancestors would have been walking through the deserts or jungle, and they were about to be attacked by a wild animal. It's that kind of response. So right in the depths of our brain, we have this response to danger. And the response is that we try and run away, we try to fight, or we freeze. And that's the way you can respond to a wild animal. Unfortunately, with a threat like the virus, none of those are very useful. And not just that, but when it goes on for over a long period of time, it leads to us starting to feel really unwell. This is where we come to the thing about not being able to sleep, people feeling very agitated, children feeling that they can't sit still, they can't do what they normally would do. They're not getting joy out of life in the way that they normally would. It's because we're basically living in a time of chronic threat. And that's a really hard thing to deal with. And I think that helping children and ourselves manage that sense of current threat, it has to be our basic priority. Because if we don't do that now, the consequences of not doing that will be severe for the children, for us, and for our families. And that's why, to me, really, academic learning is something that we can pick up later. But fundamental emotional learning, the time for that is now. So my priority with my children at the moment is making time to talk to them about how they're feeling, giving them the message it's fine to feel however they're feeling. I've tried to make the time for connection, for exercise, for playing games together, for doing things together that help us feel related to each other and feel a sense of joy together. And that's quite hard right now because I'm stressed as well. And so I find it hard to make the time to do that. And I think when we can do that, we're helping our children learn how to deal with difficult situations. And that, I think, is really the best gift that we can give them at the moment. And I think it's really important with children that we give them the message that we can cope with their worries. Because children very quickly pick up on our anxieties, and they feel that they can't tell us things because it will make us more anxious. So I think being open about our emotional response is important, but also giving the message to the children that we can cope with whatever they're going to bring to us. It's not going to affect us personally. We're not going to be terribly upset because they're upset. We need to give them a message that we can hold their anxiety. With younger children, you can actually do all sorts of things. I mean, some of these work with older children too, but creative play is really good with younger children thinking about their worries, because younger children will be struggling to work out what's going on. Some of them might not have noticed anything's going on, but they'll have noticed that, they're not going out to the parks or the playgrounds in the same way as they used to, or maybe they're not seeing their friends like they used to. So you need to provide opportunities for them to play about that. Because play is really the natural medium of children. It's how they communicate. It's how they process things. And adults, we're much more in the talking world, and we like to try and get children to talk. But if we can get down with them and play, then we can sort of tap into what's really going on for them. So with younger children, I would be trying to play with plasticine maybe, or play with little dolls from the doll's house, and maybe just introduce some themes about what's going on right now. So you could act out a little story and say, oh, Anna's really sad because she can't go to the playground, and just see where the child takes it. Just see if the child adds something in and what they say, and make it a sort of dance between the two of you as to making up a play, so that the children can bring in some of the emotions they're feeling into the play. Another thing you can do is tell stories to the child about things, about feeling anxious, about things that might be going on. There are quite a few children's books, actually, that I've seen that have been released about talking with children about COVID and about what's going on at the moment, which is another helpful way of doing it. But you could also write your own stories. Sometimes it helps children to write a story that's about another child, not about them, because it can feel a bit too pressured if it's about them. So you can write a story about a little girl who lived with her mummy and daddy and was very happy and went to school and had friends. And then one day she couldn't go to school anymore. And you and the child can write it together, and the child can illustrate it. So you're sort of making the space for them to talk about what's going on, but also helping them construct a narrative about what's going on. Because being in a place where you don't understand what's happening is very stressful for children. And they may not show that. They may not tell you that. But if they don't understand what's going on, they don't even know what questions to ask. And sometimes parents believe that by not talking to their children about what's going on, they're protecting their children from it. But actually, children pick up all sorts of things. They will pick up what's going on. It's just impossible not to at the moment. And so I would be trying to bring it into conversations, bring it into play, but not as this is a huge, scary thing, as just this is something that's happening in the world right now. And this is something that might make us all feel a bit worried right now, but we'll be able to cope with it. And we will come through the other side, and things are going to be okay, but they might be different. And this is something that we have to learn how to manage. This virus has changed everybody's anxieties. So whereas lots of clients I might have worked with might have been worried about school, they might have been worried about going out, they might have been worried about seeing other people, suddenly none of those things are allowed anymore. So that can, for a few people, that can be experienced as a great relief, because suddenly there isn't any of the pressure to do those things anymore. Unfortunately, it can also be something that exacerbates their anxiety because they're not practicing doing those things anymore. So we know that when we don't do something that makes us anxious, we get less anxious about it. But I think I've seen a few parents who've said that they've been really surprised at how their children have started to decompress from their anxiety about school, and how, in fact, the whole family has started to decompress a bit because they don't have to get up in the mornings anymore and get to school for 9 o'clock. They don't have to get everyone in their school uniform anymore. All of those things have gone. And actually, I think it's making some families think about all the things that they do for school, which they just never questioned, because they did it when they went to school, and now their children do it. And they've actually realized that a lot of their family life was structured around school. And now when that school structure isn't there, they're asking themselves, what do we have instead? What is there? And I think that's a really challenging question for families. And I started to talk about uncertainty at the beginning. And I think it also brings families into this period of uncertainty as to if we don't have this structure of school around our family, what is our family? What are we like? And I think I've seen some families really start to redefine themselves without school. And some families where the children are quite clearly starting to flourish in a way that they weren't before, which seems odd in this very restrictive time that we're in. But actually, some of the children are freer than they were before because they're no longer being pressured to do the things that other people think they should do because they can't do them. And so actually, that's giving them the chance to sort of, I think of it a bit like blossoming or unfurling, that they're able, without that pressure removed, they're able to start thinking about who they are and to working out who they want to be and what they'd like to learn. And I think that can be really amazing and transformative for families. And I think some families are learning that their family life could be quite different if they weren't all putting everybody through the pressure of school, if they didn't have to go through the school pressure. But at the same time, then there comes with the pressure of everybody being at home together all the time. So in a way, it's a shame that it's something that's so restrictive that has brought this relative freedom to some children from the pressures of school.
That does it for this episode of the Lockdown Learning Podcast. We would love to hear your feedback, as well as any other suggestions you have for future episodes. You can contact the show via email at lockdownlearningpodcast@gmail.com.
I hope you found this episode helpful. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the show on your podcast app of choice. That way you won't miss a single episode. Our next show is focused on the so-called learning gaps and parental worries about their children falling behind on their education while schools are closed. We attempt to debunk some of the myths surrounding this in the hope that you can breathe a bit easier.
Look for that episode coming soon. I'm Mark.
And I'm Kate. You've been listening to the Lockdown Learning Podcast.
Until next time, remember to take a deep breath, hug your kids, and pat yourself on the back because we know you absolutely deserve it. Be well.